Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from EyePatchNotes, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's in the lyrical narrative series, if you've seen some of those from EyePatchNotes. This one is called Clash of Ideals and Dueling Music. Boss music, EyePatchNotes begins, is often a high point in games. Maybe sadness and hope at the end of a journey, or asking the player to rise up to the challenge. And from a practical standpoint, boss music should have various textures, lest the player get bored. The same track will typically loop a few times, whether by length or failed attempts. We can start this parlay with an example from Chrono Arc versus the Forgotten King, the kind of first final boss. The music is in the description. The track and fights start with ominous chanting, followed by tense strings and hard guitar, as fitting for the final boss of a run. However, it does not take long until a segment of strictly guitar and strings plays. When the track transitions again to slower and more rhythmic chanting, we have our narrative. The chanting paints the track in the king's colors and the guitar in the player's. Like in boxing, we get a bit of red corner, blue corner energy. The track will actively pass the initiative between the two combatants and their instruments. Not only does this prevent the boss theme from getting stale, it provides an anchor point for the player's memories. EyePatchNotes can fondly reminisce on the chanty bits when King imprisons a party member, or the slamming the guitar as King drops his sword to take up a brutal axe. This is the last stretch, the final boss of Ending A, ended on a high note. Again, you could go listen to this if you wanted to. We'll be describing it in the parlay. Yeah, I think this is a great starting example. I believe that the audience might be possibly divided on being convinced of the idea that alternating parts of the instrumentalization in a piece of music really makes something feel meaningfully in practice like, oh, it's them versus us. It reminds me of something that I don't mean to insult your intelligence, audience. I think most of you are probably above such a thing, but there's this kind of anti-intellectual idea going around now that interpreting literature is just like always invalid. So if someone says like the walls were blue, like a blue that reminded me of a rainy day or whatever, there's been this line with people recently where they say, no, the walls were just blue, it doesn't mean anything. And it's like, why does it need to not mean something? But I think that there is a useful, if not particularly complicated, thread in there. A real question, though not a particularly complex question in my opinion, which is, yeah, does it actually have an effect on the audience's appreciation in a way other than like pedantry, like explaining it in a video essay? And I really strongly agree that it does in this case for instrumentalization, but I wouldn't blame someone for feeling like, yeah, does it? It's a subtle thing, but it does make you feel like there is some back and forth or a sense of scale, I guess. It makes the piece of music seem a little roomy, maybe. Just having it be that there are breakdowns and transitions between more parts of a piece of music rather than just verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Making there be more of those parts to the piece of music does make it feel vast and expansive in a way that reminds you of a battlefield or a big place or a longer fight. I think that's pretty effective. Even just having there be more different progression points in a piece of music, like adding a bridge between every verse and chorus, makes normal songs sound longer than they are. It will just make you experience them as if the time passes not as quickly as if they went by verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. If you don't believe me, try finding songs that are 3 or 4 minutes long and have a more complex structure, maybe something through composed, like Growing Old is Getting Old by Silver Sun Pickups, and then contrast that with something else that's the same length, but you could just pick any random song because most songs aren't through composed. And I believe you will experience that the time you're listening to the through composed song that doesn't repeat much of its structure will literally just feel longer than if you had a song that didn't have as many different parts. And of course, that type of like many different components to its structure, less simple structure, is typical of orchestral music, which is often what you get in these kind of epic boss battle moments. That idea that there's a lot of instruments, and so they flourish and solo, but more briefly and much more frequently as the song progresses through a rather complex path of motifs and such, definitely does allow a piece of music to feel bigger, I guess is how I'm summarizing these ideas. And I think that alone makes it feel like a boss fight even if you don't buy this idea that most people like associate themselves as being the guitar riff, associate the boss as being like the chanting or whatever. Now, I do think associating the enemy as being the chanting in Chrono Arc, where it's like the height of a tower and the establishment, sort of, and without getting way into the story of Chrono Arc, but for a lot of stories, that's the theme, and you're kind of the upstart. Is it that big of a stretch to say that many players will think, oh, like that's the orthodoxy, which is inherently the enemy, because in like 90% of media, they are the enemy? I don't think that's a stretch. I say this not so much, again, hopefully not to just bore most of you who probably accept this musical device, but because I, one, think it is interesting to discuss, like, okay, but should we accept this musical device just as is? Does it actually have that impact? And then two, to describe, well, ways it has that impact. What constructs the impact it has on the player? I personally think that this totally happens, but how? You know, what exactly happens when this occurs? I just think that's neat. So yeah, very cool. I think it's a lot of fun to hear an example, and I think that the Forgotten King theme for Chrono Arc, the first final boss's theme, is a great example of this. Very clean example that kind of came to mind for me when I started reading this parlay for the first time. I thought, oh, you're going to do something in Chrono Arc again, and I saw the splash art, but I was glossing over it. I hadn't specifically read the title of the Chrono Arc song you'd posted, and I thought, oh yeah, the boss fight was a really good example of, oh, like there it is. So yeah, it's an excellent example, I think. Yeah, the idea of the two parts kind of dueling. I do think there are pieces of music that juxtapose these things more sharply, and a conversation we could have would be what amount of this part of the song's instrumentalization, this part of the song's instrumentalization, combine them together, split them apart again. What amount of doing that, what frequency of doing that makes it feel most like the player is fighting without making the song sound ridiculous? And the answer is, I think the Forgotten King here is erring on the side of caution. You know, the two parts alternate at a totally normal sounding pace. I could see someone not actively noticing this musical device happening in this song unless they were looking for it or thinking about this subject, or like classically trained or something. You know, this is a common motif in like story orchestral music. Certainly EyePatchNotes is someone who's written a whole series of parlay on this subject. I'm not surprised you thought of it, and it did occur to me when I was playing this boss fight, but partly because you have brought stuff up like this before, and so I was primed to think about it, and I took AP Music Theory in high school. But go figure, right? It was an interesting class. Just to say that I don't think that it has no weight, this type of musical devising, where you make the music kind of play out very abstractly the drama of what is happening in the game. I don't think that that doesn't work just because someone doesn't consciously think, oh, it's about the two characters dueling. You know, I think things can vaguely have the effect in many ways, just making the piece of music feel big in scale, or just progress a lot. Having a lot of breakdowns as well, can be typical of orchestral music, makes the player kind of wake up from the, whoa, there was this crazy guitar riff, and now we're either back to the beginning of the song, if that builds up slowly, or maybe there's just like a breakdown in the song. And I think those are great moments in longer boss fights where the player goes, whew, this guy's not dead yet? Like, I might be kind of screwed here. It's still going. And I always feel like it's a great, like, moment. Of course, you know what's coming when a boss theme changes. Like, when there's a second part of the boss theme, and the player goes, oh no, like, I'm dead. That's a great effect. Not exactly the topic of this parlay, but we have to mention it. The next one. For nostalgic comparison, Wild Arms 3, PlayStation 2, 2002, can recommend. Yeah, it's a turn-based RPG where it's just guns. The magic system is guns. Like, everyone has guns. If you've played Arknights, the Laterano nation in Arknights, where you, like, inherit a gun from your family, and that's your like human rights in Laterano society. I don't know. I want to know this game just for the lore. Anyway, Wild Arms 3 has the generic boss theme, Blood, Tears, and the Dried Up Wasteland. Blood, Tears, Dried Up Wasteland You're abbreviating it as BTDUW, but I'm not going to. Starts with a drumline and brass. Like with Forgotten King, it then passes priority to a more flute-like section before all instruments are played together in a clashing fashion, almost literally as cymbals and rapid-fire synth punctuate the tensest parts of the track. Here, the two corners of the red corner, blue corner boss fight are the boss, drums, and the player, flute. Given the limited soundscape of a 2002 title, a lyrical narrative is established with Blood Tears Dried Up Wasteland's 90-second loop. One could even say for the game as a whole, with immediate cowboy western themes and everybody running around with guns in this fantasy world, Wild Arms 3, even just the character designs, has plenty of whistling and woodwinds to match the setting. This creates a game-wide association of wind instrument equals our party and the human spirit. Yeah, this is a great example. I think that a really key argument point for this idea of like the soundtrack juxtaposing the fight the player is having by showing the player and then like the boss in some musical way. A really key point for that argument is how the soundtrack as the whole of the game can help reinforce that effect. Like you said, if you have a soundtrack full of woodwinds in the characters setting off at their adventure, or, you know, a happy slice of life moment in the story, that's a really great moment to have it be, in this case, woodwinds. And then the player goes, oh, like that's us, or like good. And then when the woodwinds are popping off, and that's been your theme the whole time, you've even got a bard in the party to play the music. I think that's a nice little trick most games could benefit from anyway. And then there's some additional instrument from the boss. You're fighting a big ogre, and so you got the war drums going, and you've got the flute in the background as well, like whistling in the wind as you continue your adventure. You're reminded that this is part of your broader experience, and it kind of innately feels like, oh, it's us versus this. There's this new element. Again, the player doesn't have to be consciously thinking like, music theory, I will now call upon that knowledge to, you know, have an experience. It can just vaguely be like, oh, this is part of the adventure, but there's this new element, and they're juxtaposing each other. Combined with, again, a kind of pacing feeling, like, wow, we're back to the beginning of this boss theme. Whew, like that, this has been long. Or, you know, again, just the piece of music feeling longer. A lot of boss fights in a lot of games are, or would be, unmanageable if they were, you know, longer than 3 to 5 minutes, though there are plenty that are much longer than that. And so it can be very helpful to have a piece of music that slows down the experience. That might seem bad. I think it's good because it means that if you have an epic fight against the boss, but you do win, it makes the experience feel less like it was like 2 minutes and the boss was dead, you know. That's not necessarily bad if it literally takes 2 physical minutes of time, but it's kind of nice for your brain, your amygdala sense memory. It's your amygdala, right? For that to feel like it wasn't, you know, 120 seconds. And so I think it's very beneficial to have something like that, even if it's, again, crammed into a very small space. That's another thing I thought was a great part about this example. You picked something that's older, so it has meaningful hardware constraints. You can't just have these big-ass soundtracks. It's a 90-second song, but it gets backup from the thematic associations throughout the game's soundtrack. I'll just take your word for it. There are plenty of games that do that. And, of course, juxtaposes that with something else, uses the devices we discussed in that longer Chrono Arc boss theme. Pretty cool. Yeah, so you had a bunch of questions that I think we've responded to a little, but I think it's fun to dig into. You often do this, and I have a high opinion of this approach, so let's do it a little bit. Boss music, food for thought. Does the boss theme take turns, or is it strictly in one corner's favor? Are there any leitmotifs carried over from other parts of the game soundtrack? What surface emotions does the track seem to hold, and is the boss theme memorable, repetitive, anxiety-inducing? Cool, lots of notes. First one is, does the boss theme take turns, or is it strictly in one corner's favor? Yes, this can be a nice way to create a sense of a bit of panic as well, or an interruption in the narrative. Again, we reference the idea of the game having a soundtrack as a whole. If it's common for a new boss to be a juxtaposition of the player's theme, you know, woodwinds, let's say, going with the Wild Arms thing, and then, you know, there's drums for this boss. But then for other lighthearted moments, it will be just the woodwinds. Well, think about the effect that happens if there is no woodwind. It feels like someone has truly interrupted or stopped the player. When might this happen? Probably the most obvious thing is like the villain appears to taunt the party, something like that. And then just the villain's boss music appears. It really feels like you're being cut off in a certain way. We have an example about that a little bit later to share from Chrono Arc. There's a boss that is kind of like that. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about genre change. I think this is a good thing in soundtracks. I think having a soundtrack be like different from an album, or it's not the same as like a movie soundtrack, that it doesn't keep to the exact same like aesthetic in the same way. Certainly you want it to feel coherent with the rest of the video game, but having soundtracks for video games have a bit more range depending on the game for these kind of adventure style games that you've been talking about. Chrono Arc, I guess, is pretty like unified in its soundtrack stuff, but like Wild Arms 3, this is a relatively traditional RPG, it looks like to me from briefly looking it up. I looked it up to check if it was turn-based. And so you would imagine that there's going to be a variety of different scenarios and moods. It makes a lot of sense for the soundtrack to then be kind of open-ended and wide-ranging. Additionally, video games, even if they were on paper of the same scope of theme as a movie, I imagine something like The Hobbit, certainly the hobbits go to a variety of different environments over the course of the movie, but, the dwarves in that case, but like Lord of the Rings or whatever. Same difference. I still think that in a video game, it's often better for the soundtrack to have more range because you usually do more of a difference of things in the video game. I think an equally ranged, broadly ranged adventure as a movie versus a video game, in the video game, it may feel like more of a like breadth of adventure. And so it kind of makes sense for the soundtrack to be more broad, a little less unified in genre or theme. And an advantage of that is that the player starts to notice, if there's only one track that sounds out of place, it just sounds weird. But if there's like 50% of tracks have the player's like flute leitmotif or whatever, and then another 50% don't or juxtapose that with something else, it becomes really easy to notice when things are different, but still makes the world feel vast. Again, in a basic way that I don't think anyone would need to like analyze or pick into to notice. If you go to like another country in your fantasy role-playing game, happens in almost literally every single RPG ever, they're just being different music, like different sounds there, obviously creates a really big association, right? And so just that feeling like when you're home, that is a little bit more focused on the instruments that represent the protagonists. It will just kind of feel like your home base a little bit more. I think that that's cool. There's this gimmick in a lot of video games where when you get toward the end of the game, the sky like turns red or black, or there's perpetual evil Sith lightning thunderstorm in the sky. And I kind of hate this trope. It's frustrating to me because usually around the time that you would hit your stride with the game's build systems, therefore a time I like to kind of sink into the game a little bit more, usually the game becomes, I would argue, relatively ugly, foreboding, but not if it stays that way forever. And it's contrast. And you kind of can't get rid of that until you're through that part of the game. And I don't love this. What I think is a better way to do it is with music, with having the soundtrack change, or the player's home base city that they're restocking at or staying at the inn at or whatever is not their home city, and so the music is just kind of inherently different. You sort of remember, wow, this is like that powerful castle city that we just barely got the local lord to let us stay here, and it's because it's near where the dragon is and they're not really supposed to let us stay here, but we're here and we're right on the precipice of battle, and the music could kind of represent that. I think that makes a big difference. This is not really boss music, but it's foreboding for those bosses. And my point is that having there be the scope of the game's soundtrack to represent that makes a big difference, I think. I tricked you into transitioning to the leitmotif carried over from other parts of the game topic. And then what surface emotions does the track seem to hold? It's almost like I read these before I do them, and we just talked about that as well. We'll talk about it a bit more. I think this is also a good trick for when a boss battle is meant to evoke an emotion that is not immediately obvious. You might say this doesn't really matter, but I think it's interesting to consider. When a player has skimmed through the game's story and then they kill some character from earlier in the game, there's all those memes about like if you skip all the cutscenes, how exciting the game's narrative becomes because you just jump around and all of a sudden you're killing your best friend that you've been on the whole adventure with. Well, just having it be that on a surface level, the music for that fight is like sad or melancholy rather than like epic guitar riffs as you kill your buddy. I mean, maybe I don't. Maybe that's badass somehow. I don't know. I feel like it's sort of sad. It can be a nice way to sort of hook the player in to make it feel like the fight is supposed to be a little unfortunate, or you just vaguely experience the story without having to dig into it. I think in general, one of the problems I have with a lot of like literature interpretation, which I think a lot of people have sort of taken too far or are creating like a stupidified version of that argument, but there is like a grain of truth there, is when a story doesn't contain an element unless you heavily interpret it. When, you know, a boss fight or music doesn't contain an element, you won't experience it that way unless you dig into experiencing it, like interpreting it and stuff. What I think is preferable is for digging into it to extend the emotions that are there on the surface. Not that there is some secret version that you need some kind of passcode to open up. I personally think that is sort of just bad. Like there's nothing, it isn't really good for there to be like a secret version of your piece of media. That gives people a shallow satisfaction for being in the know, but I think this is a not good thing to do in art. It's my hot take about the subject anyway. I feel like if you're gonna have interpretation expand the themes of your piece, having them be like completely different than the themes that were there on the surface is sort of like, why didn't you hint at those things on the surface? And I guess that's a gray area. Maybe you get my point. Agree or disagree, whatever. I'm just saying that I think having the music on the surface portray something that you would feel if you kept digging into it as well. I don't know, like the theme for Chrono Ark's first final boss that we described. The Forgotten King theme, you just listen to it and you don't know that it's for the first final boss. It sounds like boss music. Like, that's it. You know, you don't have to do like music theory analysis to be like, this is some high level boss music. Like, it just sounds like a boss theme. You know, it might not be, but it just sounds like a piece of boss music. A memorable piece of music we talked about on this series before, EyePatchNotes, the Witches theme, one of the first bosses, or the first, so there's a scripted first time you fight her. I think the first boss that you fight in Chrono Arc is this witch, and the boss theme for it is an awesome demonstration of how this effect can carry out. You don't have to analyze the track to just listen to it and go, huh, this doesn't sound like the final boss of the game. There's a sort of, our adventure is just beginning, little string section, I believe, like a violin section at the beginning, and then it goes into like wub wub wub, drop in the bass, we get some electronic music, we're gonna get ready to rumble. But there's this element at the beginning where it's like, oh, this is just the start of your adventure. And it is just the start of your adventure. I have a lot of interest in using cadences to create this effect. So like surface emotions does the track hold. This can be even more surface level than just what genre or how fast or how loud is the piece of music. It could be something as simple as, what are the cadences at the end of each measure of the piece of music? Here I'm using the term cadences in a very loose way. Music theory people, please don't kill me. Just the idea that the final few notes in each measure of the track, if they go upward, if they ascend, you get ba ba ba, something like that. It kind of feels like we're continuing forward, whereas ba ba ba, it feels like we've concluded or something is sad. And if you get to the end of a measure and it goes ba 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 ba, you kind of feel something concluded. We did our thing, or we, you know, killed the enemy or completed our quest. Whereas if a track goes ba 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 ba, you go, okay, we're still going, I think. And there's a vague sense of, like that means the music is just vaguely suggesting, very, very vaguely, creating this human association that we're continuing or we're finished. And I think that type of thing is, without getting into it too much, because I'm honestly not qualified, is important, is a huge aspect of communication with music. And it's something everybody understands because that phenomenon, I believe, largely comes from language. Just when we speak, when I'm speaking to you now, note how the inflections I use at the end of each part of the thing I'm saying conclude or confirm for you whether or not I'm done speaking that or whether there is something else I have to say. Think about how if you just listen to the sounds of the things that I'm saying, because I do this quite deliberately when I speak, the cadences sort of tell you where in the thought I am. And part of the problem with something like a run-on sentence when it's spoken is that it can make it difficult to follow those cadences. There's a rule of like 3 or 5 beats, in my opinion, where you can have it be like a non-conclusive cadence, a non-conclusive cadence, and then a conclusive cadence, and that's fine. Non-conclusive, non-conclusive, and then people often do conclusive, non-conclusive, conclusive to make it feel like they have a longer thought. I sort of just did it by accident without even thinking about it. And again, there's that thing of like a longer thought, conclusive. I sort of just did it in that example, non-conclusive, without even thinking about it, conclusive. I added a little thing, so I added a non-conclusive and a conclusive to the end. We won't get into this forever, just something that for people interested in the subject, just suggesting that little bit might get you very interested in, I think, a deeply fascinating subject of human communication. I think that just that alone is a pretty solid way to write. If you had no experience writing music, to me, that is like 33% of like, if you write music that is in a coherent key and has some structure and isn't like too busy, and then you use that idea, you might be like 1/3 to 2/3 of the way to writing like an okay soundtrack for a game. And then beyond that would be, you know, the remaining 1/3 of diminishing returns where you make it artful and like beautiful or whatever. A topic well outside the scope of this parlay, I'm sure you'll agree. But yeah, and then I also think is the boss theme memorable, repetitive, or anxiety inducing, or other things? This is a great way to transition to the end of the parlay, where I feel like you can do more with these themes. You know, I definitely don't want to act like every game ought to be expected to just do every single thing that we know improves it, but there is like a simple hit list for many aspects of game design where there's probably not a great reason not to do X, Y, and Z for the soundtrack or the menus or whatever. Because these are things that are more or less the same or not too much more of a commitment to add to the game, and yet they add a lot. And I think if you're going to make a soundtrack anyway, you might as well build some of these things in. I think a big one is having there be sort of lightning rod tracks. The player is gonna hate one of the bosses. If you play your game after making it, you might be able to guess which boss, and that can be not a bad thing, as long as the mechanics are not asinine and the boss just has like a powerful trump card ability or something, or it doesn't even really kill you but just wears your party down a lot. Having that boss's music sort of like embrace that feeling can be excellent. Like there can be something wonderful about that. The boss themes for like the middle bosses in Chrono Arc, I think often do a good job of this, where it feels like there's suitably epic or stylish, but you kind of know you're going to be nickeled and dimed a little bit. You often won't die to those bosses if you played the game a lot, because your party is sort of like gotten going, but the game's difficulty isn't fully ramped up that much yet. A lot of teams are getting a kind of early mid-run power spike. And so they're often like not going to kill you, but they still have little, just a little twist, a little something. Certainly, I don't know if I would totally agree that this is one of those bosses, but we will talk about one more musical example. EyePatchNotes says, I'm somewhat loath to include a third video reference. No, you've got great examples. Why not? To make a point, Showtime, the Chrono Arc theme, is the shared boss theme between Bloody Park's Joker boss and Bloody Park 2's Bomber Clown boss. While the song does have peaks and valleys, the player is under no illusion that it is their turn. This is perhaps most obvious to EyePatchNotes during Joker's introduction. At the very beginning of the track and his boss fight, a quiet segment will play during Joker's automatic dialogue running its course. The dialogue can be skipped, but letting it play out has him declare, pick a card in time with the bass drop. Joker has set the stage, you are in his production and not the other way around. And these bosses have mechanics which impose quite heavy kind of like arbitrage on the player's actions. They are very, the boss fights are very self-centered. You know, they don't care what the player wants to do. They manipulate the order in which you play your cards very heavily. It really feels like a boss fight where the boss has stymied you or annoyed you a little bit. And it's interesting just from a game design perspective how these are mid-bosses. These are bosses in the middle of a run. Again, your build is kind of up and running, but not so much. I would argue these would be more annoying bosses and kind of less balanced bosses if you were further along in the run. You've made something really powerful, but these bosses impose heavy restrictions on you executing that powerful thing, meaning you kind of can't use it. They would sort of get buffed accidentally, or they'd be buffed. The player having something better would make them worse off against just these bosses, which I think is bad if it's taken too far. On the contrary, here they act as a sort of annoyance. Joker especially, I feel like I often lose health or resources, but I don't die. It's not particularly hard, but neither is it utterly trivial some of the time, or at least when I first started playing. And it really feels like the boss is in control of the sequencing of your abilities. I don't want to talk about this boss because I hate it, but as you mentioned, Bomber Clown shares this theme as well. And it's a very nice, a swanky jazz theme, but it feels a little electro swingy as well. And you get this idea that you're going to be bamboozled a little bit. It's a meaningful tone shift from a lot of the rest of the game as well. And having that be for these bosses that kind of take over the game mechanics a little, I think is a very pleasant aspect of the game's flow. As you progress through your run, you have this kind of interruption, a bunch of shenanigans in Bloody Park in the middle of the run. That's just really cool. And it's sort of always a distinct part of the run for me. In a lot of games that have multiple floors or regions in their run of a roguelike, you often get this feeling like it sort of blends together. They don't have their own personality quite enough. I think there are games where they try not to make this too extreme, but I actually would appreciate a little more. Hades and Hades 2 come to mind. The regions are different in some meaningful ways, but personally I think they are just shy of feeling truly unique, though there are exceptions. When you go up in Hades 2, and the second region has you teleporting between boats of an invading fleet, that is very distinct. I think that one does a just enough of a job where it's the normal gameplay, but there's a distinction to where you are. And something like this really helps. I mean, I already think that Chrono Arc does that very well, better than many other games. You really feel like you're in the starting area, Bloody Park, or that snow area that I despise even more than life itself. That is afterward. You really feel like you're in those distinct areas. The enemies feel distinct, the mood is distinct, the game gets a little tricksy, then the game gets a little sweaty in the snow area. That's why it's cold, so you don't get too stinky in that part. You might have to take a shower after playing through the third area, but the second area, you're just getting a little swifty. Pull a few grifts, pickpocket you a few times, and the music sounds like you're going to get pickpocketed a few times here in the club, as it were. So I think this is a great example. This is a really tight parlay that I feel like you structured very well, so I actually don't have too much more to say. I just think this was an excellent little topic, and I'm quite glad to see the lyrical narrative series ride on, because this has given me a lot of soundtrack music for my personal listening, but also a lot of fun. It's fun to gently flex my light knowledge of music theory. I don't have too much else to say, but I did want to say that I think this is a good case for orchestras, and then just having it be that the music is diegetic or not is an element I was interested in. When the music completely stops in a boss fight. That can be an interesting way as well to kind of break it up a little bit, or create some kind of underwater effect. The player gets hit by a big attack and the music kind of whites out, or it feels like you get submerged under something, big damage or whatever it is. I think those can be very nice effects too. Just having the music literally change as the boss is attacking can be quite cool. I understand at the beginning of the parlay when you said, you remember moments where the king imprisons the party member with the chanting, or slamming the guitar as the king drops his sword to take up a brutal axe. I don't know, but I don't believe those sections are mechanically forced to trigger with certain parts of the song in Chrono Arc, but you can do that. A common piece of software people are using to do that is called Fmod, and it lets you kind of attach triggers in the game's programming to moments in music and help sync those up to very loosely explain something I only very loosely understand, but it's pretty commonly used. You'll see it in lots of games. Limbus Company is a noteworthy example. And I like the idea of having a game that meaningfully syncs the music with what's going on. I think a subtle touch is beneficial. Nier Automata is a game that I feel does this pretty well. It kind of feels like the music is always in the right place at the right time. And Nier Automata has a big trick with its soundtrack, which is that when you move between different forms of combat or when you go into hacking, the music continues to play, but is crossfaded with a version of the track that is suited for that thing. For example, basically every song has like an 8-bit or 32-bit or whatever version that plays when you hack. So the music doesn't exactly change. It just seamlessly transforms into a pixelated version of itself and then back whenever you briefly enter the in-combat hacking minigame. It's like something you do in the middle of a fight in Nier Automata. Very weird system, but with a really interesting soundtrack part. That feeling of the soundtrack is synced up with the actions of the player, but not in a way that feels jarring. You know, they found a way to make that sort of smooth and integrated in an elegant way, I think is really cool. Having a game that took that further and did something like when you get buffs, you know, new elements of the soundtrack come in, or when you disarm the enemy's weapon, like part of the soundtrack goes out or something like that, as it kind of breaks down or builds up to you sort of taking control of the piece of music versus disarming and destroying the opponent's part of the music, could be very cool, potentially accomplished in the narrative by simply having all of the buff magic come from bards making actual music. It could be pretty cool to have that trope where you know, that thing in a lot of media where the player character is a non-combatant that for some magical related reason just kind of happens to be there, needs to be there for everybody to fight. You know, like Fate Stay Night and Fate Zero, there has to be the master for the servant to fight normally. The master just has to kind of be there, and the servant is, you know, the one doing all the fighting. There's plenty of exceptions to the rule, don't get me wrong. I don't know why they all keep getting killed. Do you know why, Urobuchi Gen, the writer for Fate Zero? Because I simply have no idea. We got this classic normal mage guy who had fire magic and would have been a great combatant, and he just mysteriously was killed before that came up. Kiritsugu and Kirei from Fate Zero are powerful combatants, and it is almost always such that they are without their servant when they fight. They're very good at fighting. The narrative goes to great pains to make it so they never fight in the same place. For Kiritsugu, it's because he and his servant have a disagreement about fighting. I think that part of the series is kind of interesting. I don't know why Kirei, and we'll leave it to avoid a spoiler, but you know who I'm talking about if you've watched Fate Zero. Why did they not fight together? That doesn't make any sense. Anyway, the point is, that trope where like the leader or the summoner or whatever is maybe like a strategist, or they have to supply magical energy, or in Limbus Company you're there as the manager to revive the sinners when they die, thematically, but like from a game perspective it's because you're the player, you need to operate the characters. You know, that trope. What if that character is just a bard and their thing is they like do songs to buff up their party? Whenever you get an RPG where your player character can't leave the field, but other players can leave the field, other characters can leave the field. So in Metaphor Refantatio, you get 7 party members, but one of them, your canonical main character protagonist guy that you name, cannot be swapped out. Everybody else can, but you can't. And I always, pretty much always, make that character into like an offensive support, like a buffer, or in Metaphor Refantatio, you can do this kind of like time magic, like turn length increasing thing. If you play Metaphor, it's the class you unlock at the penultimate part of the game, has an ability that gives you more turn icons, and then if you stack luck, you can use Faker's Roguery to usually get more turn icons. Often enough that with the buffer of getting more guaranteed every time, you will extend your turn. You can get very long turns doing this. Your other units better be able to pull that weight. And the idea that that would modify the music or act as a sort of trigger for the music in some way could be really fun. You can also definitely structure music in such a way that it is more likely to hook into that type of design. You can build music in such a way that it's likely to feel like a boss fight already, and we've talked about that a lot already in this parlay. But it would be particularly interesting to set up a song in such a way where there were like multiple kind of steps or stops. This is a moment in the song where If taken in isolation, it would feel like a pretty complete section, even though it is actually part of this longer structural element of the song. So if the player does something where we want the mood of the song to transition around now, we wait until that part of the song is over and then just accept it as a transition point and move the song into this, bit of structure. I'll leave you with something related to that technology that I was interested in high school but never really saw took off. There was this idea for like an MP3-like file format, where there could be different solos, like guitar solos, for example, different kinds of solos maybe in your rock song. And so you download the song and there would be essentially 4 versions of it, and they could swap in at random, like different solos throughout the song. Or a live band, you could have like a bunch of different live performances of their music. This is something I'm not opposed to being interested in, but currently and in the past have not really been into. Like, I'm not that interested in live music. I like music as this produced thing. I'm not particularly attracted to like the imperfection of music as a living art form. I don't think it's ugly or bad. I could be very interested in the future, but that isn't what it is to me at the moment. That's all. I don't have that perspective yet. So I never really got into it, but you can see how that could be really interesting for a game like this. If you just made small variants of each piece of music and being a little more sterile about it, as I'm wont to be, I do think that could take relatively minimal development effort as well. You could make minor variations of a track that react to things the player did in pretty interesting ways, like without it taking a ridiculous amount of time. Just changing the length of the pieces of music or making them modular in some way. I don't know, it just seems like it could be a lot of fun, and you could do a lot to ensure that these kinds of moments happen. I think one of my takeaways from this parlay is how effective it can be even when you don't do things like that. Even if you just make a piece of music that contains the moods and moments the player would want, and then those moments are like a certain length. As the boss fight plays, there's a decent chance that they're going to line up such that the player will have that experience. And I mean, if it's a boss fight you're doing over and over, or the end of a run and you're going to do runs over and over in this game, yeah, there's a pretty good chance the player is going to hit on that moment. As you said at the very beginning, whether it's because the player is going to just die over and over again, or the boss fight is really long, or the player is going to do a bunch of runs even if they win. Boss fight music, in a way, kind of should have some texture to it, because it can be that easy to give the player this like powerful moment of the music and the boss lining up. I know I even go further and often associate songs I like or am into, or that fit the vibe of something I'm doing, into games I play, even if they're not related to the game at all. I have this one song from the Persona 3 soundtrack stuck in my head about this whip build that I made in Elden Ring, and I'm a complete nerd. That's the way it works. But that is powerful, even though it's not even part of the game's soundtrack. I just have a very strong sense memory of guard countering with the whip and the Persona 3 soundtrack kicking in, because that happened. I was just listening to it while I was playing. For no reason at all, it's just what happened. So a topic I'd be interested in hearing even more about. You had some excellent examples as usual. You can listen to the music in the description, folks, if you'd like to. Thanks for the parlay. If you'd like to get your own parlay like this, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. You can ask whatever you want. If it requires like some prep or some listening through things, just know that I often won't be able to play them during the parlay, but it's perfectly reasonable to say, oh, just listen to like 5-ish minutes of music before you start. That's fine. It's my on-the-spot responses to the things you submit, but I'm not held at gunpoint and forced to hit record the moment I finish reading your parlay. It can be like 5 minutes of prep. That's fine. I wouldn't be able to make like an entire tier list, for example, unless you want me to do it during the parlay and you set it up for me. But this is a totally fine amount of prep, or actually pretty ideal amount of prep. Just 1 or 2 and musical examples can be really easy to talk about during a parlay. So, love it. Looking forward to the next one.